But one of the most, and a very understandable retort, is that this cannot be because it is the return of Jesus Christ. Not the return of somebody else with a different name. And this individual that you refer to, Baha'is, as Baha'u'llah, we know when he was born, who he was born to, he grew up, became a man. So he cannot be the return of Jesus Christ. And I remember having and it was a very loving conversation with a Christian friend of mine. And I said, it was a long relationship, and I said, it's difficult because if I accept that principle, that it is impossible that Baha'u'llah could be the return of Jesus Christ and yet have come from the womb of someone and have been grown up, I wouldn't have to reject just the Baha'i faith, I would have to reject Christianity. He found this surprising, and he asked me why I would say such a thing. And I said, because in the New Testament, and I asked you to investigate this, John the Baptist, the forerunner of Jesus Christ, was claimed by Jesus Christ to be Elijah, an Old Testament prophet who had lived over 1,000 years prior. The Jews, which occurs at the end of the book of Malachi, are waiting for the coming of Elijah before the great and terrible day of God. John the Baptist was born and grew up, and his name was John. And then he actually starts preaching the coming kingdom of God. When the disciples finally understand Jesus Christ to be the Messiah, he is asked, but aren't we told that Elijah was supposed to come first? And he says, if you will hear it, or if you will receive it, Elijah has come. And they knew that he was talking about John the Baptist. So either an individual can return and be the same individual in some sense, and this is explored within Baha'u'llah's writings, and yet have been born of a womb and grown up, or else Elijah cannot be John the Baptist, and thus Elijah didn't come, and therefore Jesus Christ cannot be the Messiah. I bring this up because this is a backfire. You might see, for example, this is very odd as a Christian looking at the Baha'i faith, but not have noticed that this is very odd from a Jewish perspective when they look at Christianity. If you do not believe that there could be a case in which a prophet who is the head of state of a group of individuals who he actually has to protect and will be attempting to be exterminated by local tribes and groups, this is the case of the Prophet Muhammad, if you do not believe that in such a case that individual would resort to defensive warfare to protect the community, how do you answer the conquest of Canaan in the Old Testament? How do you answer some of the actions of the individuals within the Old Testament, which you yourself believe to be scriptural? How do you, for example, understand as a Hindu then, if you made the same objection to Islam, how do you understand the opening of the Bhagavad Gita, wherein Arjuna does not wish to fight in a battle? For anyone who isn't aware, the Bhagavad Gita, a central Hindu text, takes place in the context of a battlefield, where Arjuna does not want to fight, but he actually is a warrior caste and is supposed to be defending the community. How do you understand as a Hindu why that is acceptable, and if a similar thing is happening in the case of Islam, that is unacceptable? This gives us the understanding, if you will, of both of these cases. If you accept an argument in the case of the spirit, right? Were this people today to receive answers and reply to such questionings, they would unhesitatingly reject and denounce them. But they have accepted the same kinds of ideas, the same kinds of arguments from their forefathers. Another example quickly passing to throw out there is that oftentimes I have individuals who will accept arguments about the existence, the real existence of mathematical objects, yet when the exact same argument is presented for the existence of moral properties, they seem to suddenly spin. One it proves and the other it disproves. Too often we accept very bad arguments from people who agree with us. Too often. And it is important for the intellectual epistemological evolution of our own communities to be able to lovingly disagree with each other and lovingly and respectfully question each other within our own communities. And that once we see that an argument is not valid or does not support the conclusion we wished, we should, in that independent investigation of truth, put it aside, rejoice, and be willing to share a better answer with someone. This is very important with our own communities, but it's also important across communities. For example, if I were a Christian and I said that it is not that Baha'u'llah is the return of Christ, if I had said it is impossible that Baha'u'llah could be the return of Christ because his name was Mirza Hussein Ali and he was born in Iran. And then I actually have a Baha'i share with me the fact that, well, maybe Baha'u'llah isn't the return of Christ. That might actually be true. He might not be. At the same time, it is important to note that John the Baptist was Elijah and yet had been born of a womb recently, and people had watched him grow up. So we know that that can happen, so it's obviously possible. It doesn't mean Baha'u'llah is the return of Christ, but it is possible that it could be. And he could be Jesus Christ, and yet at the same time have been born recently from a womb, from a woman in Iran. That when I hear that, not only is it important that I myself take hold of it, it's also very important that if I am in a room, this is the note on honesty part, and I hear one of my Christian brothers say, well, Baha'u'llah can't be the return of Christ, because he's not Christ, his name isn't Jesus. And this man, Baha'u'llah, was born Mirza Hussein Ali Nuri in 1817. So he can't possibly be. If I am not merely interested in preaching to the choir, if I'm really on a path of independent investigation of truth, and I want to be intellectually honest, I should say to my Christian brother, I don't believe actually Baha'u'llah is who he says so either. The one thing I do know is that this argument doesn't work. Because were to I accept this, I would have to claim that it would be impossible that John the Baptist was Elijah, and I would have to take Jesus Christ as lying in the New Testament, and that a prophecy had failed. And he might say, yes, but Jesus, Baha'u'llah is not the return of Christ, and I could say honestly, I don't think so either. I think there's other problems. But just to be honest, among ourselves, it does not do us well. It does not serve truth to represent it with falsity. The truth never needs this. So let us investigate other ways that, for example, Baha'u'llah is not the return of Christ. But this one does not lead anywhere. This is what I would call the preaching to the choir on the one hand, because I'm questioning my brother, or my sister as she represents this, but at the same time a note of honesty. I myself don't believe that to be true. This is why I often say to Baha'i friends that it's important that we begin to really learn how to disagree gracefully, lovingly, and to accept that as a part of a consultation and put aside what we thought was a good argument or a truth and rejoice that we have found something new. Imagine you're discussing the seal of the prophets, which is the doctrine or the dogma, or I believe within Islam, that there can be no prophet after the Prophet Muhammad. Just imagine, for the sake of discussion, that you actually have solved that, and you can present it in a way that a person can understand, well, wait a minute, there actually could be. Very often what occurs in our avenues of approach and dialogue is that someone will say, yeah, but Baha'u'llah says, he says he's God and he gets rid of Islamic law, so he can't be. This is again a note on intellectual honesty and a principle of isolating objections. I would say, okay, pause for a second. Once again, Baha'u'llah can be completely false, just like with Elijah and John the Baptist. And at the same time, the Islamic community's understanding of the seal of the prophets can also be false. These are isolated issues. So maybe, for example, there really and truly is a conscious, to the degree to which we can say that, moral fabric underlying the universe. And that moral, whatever you want to call it, actually represents itself to humankind and communicates ways that humankind can interact and should interact with each other, and that the moral order behind the universe includes moral and conceptual truths to which humankind are held accountable unto. And that sounds very much like God, and that is completely represented within Buddhist scripture. That it is a functional definition I have no problem with. And then a person says to me, say from the Buddhist community, or someone who just knows about Buddhism, well, nevertheless, Buddhism teaches the doctrine of no self, the doctrine of anatman. I can easily say, yeah, and maybe I am completely and utterly wrong about anatman, but that is a different topic. That is a different issue. It is an isolated objection. But we could have something that looks very much like a God, that is communicative, that actually represents itself to humankind, that gives a path to actually draw oneself out of the quagmire of this world towards the divine worlds. And that sounds very much like the God that I personally read within the New Testament or the Quran. And the doctrine of no self just kills it. That's over. So we have to try to understand, if you will, that for example, the doctrine of resurrection, which from the Baha'i perspective to the Christian perspective might seem very different. And if I actually begin to solve this issue, very often in my own interactions, as this begin to really try and understand each other better, and that the Christian sees that I don't see it the way they think I see it, and we come closer and closer together, I'll suddenly have, yeah, but there's no way, right? There's no other way to God except through Jesus Christ. I can say, maybe you're right. But at the same time, maybe we don't have this problem, this issue of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. This brings us finally to the last principle, and thank you for spending time with me, that we're going to have to dedicate another section to, an actual entire 1 or 2 series, which is that of the divine assayer. It is actually how and why God tests humankind, why and how we are brought towards claims, and we are always presented a way out. We're always presented a way we can reject, and turn away. And it's that the underlying principle of it all is that goals that are worthwhile don't come for free. And there's always a reason not to train, not to practice, not to read. There's always a reason to turn aside on many of these roads. You will always find one. But it's an important thing to understand about the nature of the reality in which we live, that it is a gym, not a spa. And the things of great worth demand sacrifice and time and work. And I think in the future we will look at how God has the same principle that we see operating everywhere at work within the divine religions. That really and truly, we don't have to see the unity of religion. We don't have to see the truth or the reality of God or of his messengers. But we can if we're willing to put in an independent investigation, which is based upon and necessitates the entertaining of the possibility that maybe all these colors are different expressions of the same underlying phenomenon. Maybe the underlying phenomenon actually exists that unites all the elements of the periodic table. That a gas is made up of the same thing of a solid or a liquid. Maybe we can really begin to entertain the possibility that we all have a common biological ancestor, but we're going to have to do research in any of these areas to find out if they're true. And maybe that's true for the unity of religion, and I hope some of these avenues of approach have shed some light on how I myself as an individual might perceive that. Thank you.